Just for a little background, I worked on the police force as a street officer for over 10 years before I got the chance to work in homicide. Believe it or not, homicide detective is generally one of the most coveted jobs in the policing. Once I finally got my opportunity, I seized it and never looked back. I don't mean to brag, but I'm very good at what I do. I reached a status in the field of homicide investigations that I often get called out to other departments to assist them. It's a mostly thankless job, as people only remember the name of the killer and not the person who put them behind bars, but I don't desire a spotlight anyway. A little extra pay wouldn't hurt though. To be fair, very few murders that are committed are ever done by a serial killer, and it is typically who you would think it is. A jealous ex, a cheating spouse, a drug deal gone wrong, gang fights, and while suicides are obviously not a case of murder, they are also left to the homicide department. This is what my job mostly consists of. However, on rare occasions, I do get assigned to a serial killer case. My most recent case is, how should I put this, unique. I mean, every case is unique, of course. No two serial killers are exactly the same, but they all typically follow a sort of pattern. This was something that I had never seen before. It started out like any normal investigation. An on-duty officer received a call about suspicious noises next door, and the officer found an unresponsive woman inside. He requested backup and made sure the scene was secure. Then my crew of investigators was called to the scene. The homicide department responds to any death, including murder, suicide, accidents, and even natural deaths, so I wasn't too surprised when I first arrived at the scene. The body was that of a middle-aged woman. There was still some color to her body, but it was clear that gravity was beginning to bring the blood downwards since it no longer flowed in her body. Her eyes were also milky, so my best guess was she had been dead within the 1-2 hour range. The coroner would be able to put a more accurate time on it later. She was lying on the kitchen floor, but there were no wounds or even bruises to be found on her. At least on the outside, there could be some type of internal damage. But once again, the coroner would have to update me on that. There had been no signs of forced entry to the house, and there were no signs of any type of struggle. She was fully clothed, with no rips or tears anywhere in her clothing. By all accounts, it appeared like a natural death of some sorts, which is somewhat of a broad category, but most common is a heart attack. However, something just seemed off to me. I had seen plenty of heart attack victims and this just didn't seem right. If she had suffered a heart attack or some other sort of internal trauma, then why was she lying perfectly face up on the floor, with no fall wounds, and the kitchen was as tidy as could be, nothing out of place? Clearly the neighbors had heard something to make the call to the police. It just didn't all add up. That's when I noticed it in the corner of the room, a video camera. Grab that camera, find out if the victim had a security system. It should help us to see what happened here, I said to one of my underlings. I looked over the body one more time and looked around the house, but it all just seemed too normal to me. I would have to wait for the coroner's report and to see what was on that camera. Luckily, it didn't take too long to find the contents of the camera, but it only fueled my suspicion even more. It turns out the woman did have a security system. It made sense since she lived alone. However, it seemed quite convenient that the cameras shut off briefly before the victim's estimated time of death. From the last footage on the camera, as well as another camera in her living room, we can see the victim entering her home and going to the kitchen. It appeared as if she was going to open a cabinet when the footage stopped. No cabinets had been opened when we arrived at the scene, and her body was lying on the opposite side of the kitchen, nowhere near where the cameras had cut off. It still made zero sense to me. Then came the coroner's report. Heart attack, I asked mockingly. Heart attack, the coroner said in a somewhat dissatisfied tone. Was there any sort of trauma from a potential fall? Nope, I checked everything. She appeared in good shape. Was there no other abnormalities? These things happen sometimes, detective. You just have to accept it. I couldn't accept it though. It didn't feel right. I wouldn't be able to continue the investigation as things stood though. There was absolutely zero evidence of foul play, and I knew the department wouldn't allow me to continue an investigation as such. It would take at least one more, if not several more of these oddities to pop up for them to set me loose, but I just knew that this wasn't the end. However, for the time being, I did have to move on. Serial killers have a cooling off period, so I would have to wait for new evidence to appear or another death to occur. Until then, I would have other work to do and more crimes to solve. A few weeks went by, and while I hadn't forgotten about the odd case, it had been pushed to the back of my mind. I couldn't afford to have my mind clouded while I still had other deaths to figure out. Everything had gone back to as normal as it could get in my line of work when my deputy detective Alex plopped an envelope on my desk. "What's this?" I asked her. "I don't know. Someone from the tech crew gave it to me and told me it was evidence from one of your cases. They said they already made copies," she said, then shrugged. I opened the envelope to find a USB device inside. Even if it had been tested by our tech crew, I always err on the side of caution. We have a computer in our office specifically for viewing this type of evidence. That way, if there was some sort of deeply encrypted virus, we wouldn't risk infecting our computers filled with classified information. I wasn't sure what I was dealing with at the time. I tend to work multiple cases at once, so this could have been a variety of things. Alex had been vague, but she was one of the few people I could normally rely on, so I opened the file on the USB. It was a video file, and just from the preview I knew exactly what it was. It was the missing footage from the mysterious heart attack case. My attention became entirely focused on the video. It started where the last footage had left off. The victim opened up one of her cabinets and grabbed a cup. She opened her refrigerator and pulled out what seemed to be some sort of juice container. It was at this moment that from the second camera, I could see someone entering her front door. The person was medium-sized with a male figure, and he was wearing a typical burglar-style mask. He had begun to slowly walk towards the kitchen, one sinister step at a time. Meanwhile, the victim had begun to drink her juice. As the intruder reached the doorway of the kitchen, the victim had begun to wobble on her feet. Something was wrong with her. Then it seemed as she passed out and began to fall to the floor. She didn't hit the floor though. The masked man caught her. He then laid her down gently in the exact spot that we found her. After lying her down, the man stood up and stared directly into the camera. Unfortunately, it was black and white footage, so I couldn't tell his eye color. I'm sure if I saw those cold eyes in person, I would recognize them though. I've looked into the eyes of serial killers before, and this was something more terrifying than I had ever seen. As the staring contest continued, I began to wonder if what I was looking at was even human. The footage was weeks old, but it seemed as if the man was looking directly at me, like one of those paintings where the eyes follow you, no matter how you move. That's when the footage ended, and not only did it end, it began to delete itself. I was still in somewhat a state of shock from what I had seen to really comprehend what was happening. Before I knew it, the footage was gone. The copies were of course a lie. What I had seen was the only footage of what had happened, and it was gone. No evidence remained. I must have grilled Alex for an hour on what she told me before I let up. She was usually dependable, but this sort of thing never happens, so perhaps she had become complacent when accepting the evidence. The person who had given her the envelope was someone we were familiar with, but the person who they obtained it from was not. We had to follow a long line of people to find out we knew nothing about who had delivered the USB. It was frustrating to know we had lost valuable evidence, and I was the only person who had seen it. It was obviously planned out this way. The perpetrator clearly wanted me to see that footage, and only me. It is common for serial killers to toy with the police, and I knew now that I was about to enter a dangerous game. I knew I was clearly at a disadvantage because I had no clue what I was up against, but I'm sure he knew everything about me. On top of everything, I attempted to call the coroner who had told me there were no abnormalities in the victim. That had said the toxicology report was clean, but I knew there had to be something in what the victim had drank. Of course, the same coroner who had performed the autopsy hadn't shown up to work since that day he lied to me, which told me one of three things. 1. He was the killer. 2. He was a pawn of the killer and had run away. 3. The killer had used him and killed him. I found it unlikely that there were any other options. The first seemed the least likely, since I had confirmed the man had performed plenty of autopsies in the past and didn't fit the typical profile of a serial killer. Plus, I was certain his eyes were not the ones I had seen. I was leaning towards him being dead already. Despite everything, I still had nothing. Other than a brief stare down, there was no physical evidence. I returned home that night more frustrated than I had ever been. When I opened my door, I found something I hadn't been expecting. It was a letter, and yes, it was from my new suspect. Here is what it read. Hello detective, having a good day. Mine has been wonderful. I hope you enjoyed my gift. I've had my eye on you for quite some time. You always find your man, but can you find me? I doubt it, but I do hope you give it your best shot. You will have to make a very important choice soon, one that has no true right or wrong answer, but I won't spoil the surprise. The fun has just begun. I hate to admit it, but reading the letter gave me a small adrenaline rush. I had no clue what the future would hold, and I was at a complete and utter disadvantage. The killer knew who I was, where I lived, and who knows what else. I knew by his words he would kill again soon, and there was nothing I could do yet. The fun had truly just begun. I had become the mouse in a game of cat and mouse. As a detective, I would normally be the one in the role of chasing after someone, but not anymore. I had become the center of someone's sick and twisted game. It often happens that a killer will toy with the police, taunting them of what they got away with, at least for the time being. However, most serial killers have their preference in victims, and will do whatever is necessary to avoid getting caught. Which is why you don't see serial killers target cops as victims. Not only does it bring the risk of someone being armed, but it will bring more attention to the crime. It sounds fucked up, and it is, but if a police officer dies, the entire force will be on high alert until the culprit is found. Whereas if a prostitute is found dead, it's just another day at the office. Personally, I put the same amount of emphasis on solving murders regardless of the victim, but not everyone is me, and clearly the man after me is not the typical killer. A strange letter had been delivered to my door. Could I guarantee it was from a killer? No, but I would place everything I owned on it being so. I had run tests on the letter, and of course there were no fingerprints or any other DNA left behind on it. It was typed out too, so there would be no way of matching handwriting. The letter had also been very vague and not necessarily threatening from the outside. However, I could see its deeper meaning. Something was about to go down, and I would be in the middle of it all. Until something did happen though, I would go about my life as normal. Even though the killer knew where I lived, I would not move. If he wanted me dead, I would most likely have already been dead. No, he wanted to have some fun with me. Even if I did jump from hotel to hotel, he was most likely stalking me and would find me wherever I went. I would have to play his game until he slipped up or gave me anything to work with. Several weeks went by with no new developments or any contact with the killer, until late one night when I was woken up by my work phone. Murder waits for no one, and even when I'm off the clock, I'm on the clock. If a body is found, it is my job to get there as soon as possible. I was given an address and told the scene had been secured. However, when I arrived to the address, I noticed there were no other police vehicles in the vicinity. This was a major red flag. On top of this, my work vehicle was currently getting maintenance, so I didn't have access to a police radio to ask what was going on. I still had my phone though, so I could just call the station and ask, except I conveniently had no signal. I understand that at this point I should have driven away from the scene, contacted backup, and asked what was going on. This should have been the only decision I made, as it was the only logical one to make. Yet, it was not what I did. Instead, I grabbed my pistol and approached the home of the address. There were no lights I could see on inside the home from the outside. It was a modern-looking two-story home. No cars were parked in front. When I reached the front door, I could see it was slightly ajar. I readied my gun and slowly pushed my way inside. It was pitch black inside, so I immediately searched for the light switch. I gained no benefit from creeping around in the dark. I wouldn't give an added advantage to anyone already hiding. With the lights on, I could see that the house was empty. No furniture, nothing. Well, at least the base floor was empty. As I made my way up to the second floor, I could see entrances to 3 rooms. 2 were open, and like the rest of the home, were empty. The final door, however, was closed. Before entering, I checked my phone. I had signal again. I instantly texted someone I knew was working. I told them the address and to have backup sent just in case. I was facing a double-edged sword. I could wait for my backup to arrive before proceeding, ensuring my safety. However, if there was someone on the other side of that room that needed my help, then I could be running out of time. Once again, I chose the latter option. I made my presence known before kicking down the door. When I received no response, I proceeded inside the room. I wasn't exactly expecting what I found inside. From the moment I kicked in the door, I could see someone tied to a chair inside. I could tell they were still breathing, but they seemed to be unconscious. I slowly inched forward into the room. After making sure there was no one in any of the corners, I went to the closet door in the room. I readied my gun once more and swung it open. There was no one inside the closet. There was a gift-wrapped box inside though. At this point, I should have made sure the person in the chair was okay, but instead I felt an urge to open the box. Inside the box was a syringe filled with a clear liquid. Next to it was a small note that read, "Give her the medicine or I will kill 2 more." I turned back to the woman in the chair. She was still unconscious. I didn't recognize her. She was just a stranger. She could have been anyone off the streets. I know how serial killers think, and I knew he wasn't lying to me. He was watching me right now. If I didn't inject whatever was in this syringe into her, then he would keep his word in killing 2 more people. I thought back to the first body, the woman who had died of a mysterious heart attack. Was this the substance that caused it? For a split second, I considered injecting it into the girl. That was it though. It only took a split second for me to realize I couldn't do that. Whether or not I did what he wanted, he would continue to kill. I may be the mouse, but I wouldn't be a puppet. I set the box on the floor and immediately began untying the girl from the chair. I once again checked to make sure her vitals were okay, and she seemed to be fine. It wasn't long before my backup arrived and we were able to have the girl safely transported to the emergency room. She suffered no major injuries and would recover just fine. After explaining what happened, I had my team check every inch of the home for prints or any sort of evidence. I also made sure the syringe was transported to a reliable source that could test the liquid as soon as possible. Of course, we couldn't find any further evidence. This guy was beyond good at covering his tracks. All I could hope was that the liquid inside the syringe could help us make any sort of advancement in the case. However, that was the most infuriating part. It didn't take long at all for the lab to tell me what the needle held. Sugar water. The girl would have been fine no matter what decision I made. He just wanted to see what my reaction would be to his sick proposition. He wanted to see me squirm. If I had injected her, perhaps I could have saved 2 people, but since I hadn't, he would now use that as justification to kill 2 more. He probably knew that I would never have done what he asked, but he wanted me to have mental anguish and regret over my decision, to sow the seeds of doubt in my head. I wouldn't let him get to me though. No matter my decision, he would continue to kill until he was behind bars or rotting in the earth. Indeed, the killer kept true to his word. Several days after saving the girl, I was called to a new scene, this time by actual law enforcement. Inside this home, the bodies of 1 male and 1 female were found. They were found together in the master bedroom, holding hands in the bed. Those 2 hands were the only parts of the bodies that were not extremely mutilated. I have seen my fair share of gruesome crime scenes, but this was near the top. Many of my colleagues had to take breaks from the room, and I didn't blame them. There was also a message written in blood on the wall. As promised, it mocked me. After this, I was granted permission to invest my full focus into finding this psychopath. Against my wishes, the chief said he would also be calling the FBI and asking for them to send people to assist me. Everyone always thinks the FBI is the solution to crimes like these, but often it is local detectives that do most of the work. They would most likely hamper me more than aid me, but the final decision wasn't mine. This was all new for me. Once again, no useful evidence had been left behind. I was hoping with as much blood had been in the room we would at least find a partial footprint, but no, I would have to think outside the box to catch this person. I was the center of their game, and I had to find a way to use that against them. There had to be a way. Until they made their next move though, all I could do was wait. Over the past several months, I have been wrapped up in a game with a serial killer. Although it was more of a blowout, and not in my favor, he had thoroughly outdone me and I still had little to nothing to show for it. I knew the tides had to turn soon, because if they didn't, bodies would begin to pile up. I already knew more people were bound to die, and I couldn't stop it. In my line of work, you have to know you can't save everyone, but I have to try to save as many as possible. I knew I was most likely being watched at almost every turn. I had to be extra cautious when I was around any sort of technology. Even though I know it was impossible for him to hack everything, I had to assume that he could. I had to be creative in sending messages and relaying information to others. I still had no true counterattack, but I did put out a few pieces of bait in attempts to get any sort of a lead. These were long cons with a very small chance of success, but I had to try something. I had no way to track the killer nor to even predict who he would kill next. While most killers have a preference, this person did not. Well, I suppose I may be his preference, but I would be his dessert, his final victim, until he could find another like me and play his game all over again. I didn't have any direct leads, but I did have one idea. Many killers have a tendency to go back to the scene of their crimes, typically to relive their twisted fantasies. So, I decided to visit the home of the first victim, well, at least the first I knew about. The home had been cleared out since the previous resident had suffered a heart attack. I was granted permission by the landlord to look through the home once again. My team and I had done a thorough job of checking the place out already, so I knew if I found any evidence it would be from a return visit from the killer. I knew this too was a long shot, but until the killer made his next move, I had nothing else to focus on. So I entered the home. I opened every door and cabinet, looked in every corner, and I found nothing. It was possible the killer had returned to the scene, but he hadn't left anything for me to find. Instead, I decided to leave something for him. I pulled out a small envelope and placed it in the exact spot he had laid down the first victim. What is inside the envelope? Only a simple piece of paper with 2 words on it: "You lose." Less than an hour after I left the home, my police radio went off. There was a new crime scene. It was a single body this time, an older male, similar to the first crime, and completely opposite from the second. There appeared to be no outward damage to the body. I could tell the man had been dead for at least a day, perhaps longer. Due to the age of the man, this could have easily been considered a natural death, if not for the way he had been posed. The man was lying down on the floor face up. With his right hand he held up 4 fingers. He was the 4th victim. His left hand was covering his mouth in a fashion that one would do to stifle a giggle. Other than this blatant mockery, there was no other evidence left at the scene. However, this would be the last time he would leave no evidence. My radio went off again, but this time with good news. "Report back to base," the voice at the other end said. Now this would seem to most as a simple thing to say and to follow, but it wasn't. I had to assume the killer had access to my radio signals, so this was the secret code I had made up. As far as anyone knew, I had gone to the first crime scene alone. Even the chief of police believed I had gone alone, but I hadn't. Days before I went, I had managed to get a secret message to an undercover cop, and they had been watching the home for over 48 hours, taking only minimal time to sleep and eat, and it had paid off. I had a hunch he wouldn't be able to resist seeing what I had left for him, and he assumed that if my attention, as well as the rest of my team's, was focused on a body at the other end of town, then he could slip in and retrieve what I had left. Now, we had eyes on someone taking that bait. Of course, this simply could have been another puppet of the killer though. I had already instructed the undercover agent to simply follow the man. Once the man had reached his base of operations, then we would move in. Until then I had to wait. It worked. I later was informed by the undercover agent that the killer had taken extremely complicated routes and was almost impossible to follow, but not quite impossible, as the agent was also quite good at what he did, and he was able to do it without getting discovered. Once the killer pulled into a large building, the agent sent out the second secret code for us to surround his location. We were able to completely surround the building before the person inside had a chance to know what was going on. He had nowhere to run now, or so we thought. As police flooded in through every entrance, they found no one inside the building. His car was inside, stolen of course, as well as many other things, but he was not. We soon discovered a tunnel that was under the building. It stretched far out into a nearby forested area where the killer had most likely left some sort of off-road vehicle. He may have gotten away, but he was no longer in control. He had never intended for us to find his base, but he was smart enough to always have an escape just in case. We found photos of all the victims to this point, as well as many photos of myself. We found fingerprints. Of course they didn't match any in our system, but it was something that could prove beneficial in the future. We would be able to inform officers to fingerprint on any traffic stop, at least until we got a match. One small slip up, and he would be ours. As we all know though, some animals are most dangerous when they are backed into a corner. I knew sooner or later he would still come for me, even if it meant getting caught. He wanted to best me. Ultimate victory would only come to him after he had claimed my life. However, I wasn't his next victim quite yet. After our discovery of his base, the killer went into a full-on rampage. He killed 5 people throughout the next week. These were unlike his previous crime scenes. They were messy, with evidence left in bundles. All of these 5 murders were done with a large blade, likely the same one that claimed victims 2 and 3. He had stopped maintaining the blade, however, as by the 5th victim in his spree it was obvious the blade had become duller, and much more force had been put into the swings in order to finish off the victims. He left fingerprints, shoe prints, and from the impact and trajectory of the wounds on the victims, we were able to estimate a height and weight range. It was unfortunate we were unable to stop his spree at the moment, but we're getting much closer. While the killer was now likely operating out of rage, it was clear he still kept some of his intelligence. It was likely these victims were already the ones he had planned out for the future, and we had simply expedited his process. He knew their schedules and was still able to catch them off guard, being able to escape before police could arrive. At the scene of the 5th victim of his spree, his 9th overall kill, he left me a message in blood once more, and then there were 2. I was always to be his 10th victim. He had planned to toy with me more, but I had ruined that for him. In his mind, he could still win if he were able to kill me. I couldn't win this game. 9 people had died on my watch. I could never feel victorious knowing that. All I could do is stop him from killing anyone else. If it took my death to finally end this all, then that's all that mattered. Ironically, most killers get caught by doing something completely unrelated to the killing itself. So, I could have surrounded myself with armed police at all times and waited for him to slip up, but I knew he would kill more if I did this, just to send a message. No, I knew what I had to do. I had to face this monster alone. I knew exactly where he wanted me to go as well. It was time for the final showdown.